Another common task to use the retouching tools in Photoshop is the restoration of old photographs. Here you can see the old damaged photo on the left and the retouched version on the right. Now it's still black and white, but it's also possible to colorize black and white photos based on references or just simply by deciding what colors could have been on the original background, clothes, skin, and so on and so forth. So let me show you an example. Here's this lovely image of these two kids. And first, what I'm going to do is try to remove these scratches from the image. Just like always, the first thing I would do is to create a separate layer. And I'm going to call that one Retouch. Then I will switch to the Spot Healing Brush tool. And I'm going to try to remove most of the bigger problems in the background. So where I know it's going to do a good job without me sampling at all from the image. Once I removed most of these problematic areas on one side, I'm just going to move on to the other side. And remember, when you go over a whole area like this here, it will automatically remove that whole section. Not like when you only go over smaller details, leaving some of the scratches behind. That will always just duplicate details that you wanted to remove in the first place. So like here in this area, I might try to have a bigger brush and paint over all that detail and hoping to get a good result. Actually, the hair doesn't look bad here, but we can try to paint over these details just to improve that part as well. Now you see, this won't give you a good result. If you need to fill in some details like this, you can always use the clone stamp tool. So I would sample from this part here using all layers. I just sample and paint over that part there. That looks slightly better, and we can always refine our retouching. So I can switch to healing brush as well and then go over some additional details like these here. Again, I'm removing mainly the scratches from the background. And then by sampling from the face, I can also remove these smaller details like scratches here on the cheek or on the forehead. But in this case, I'm using the healing brush and not the spot healing brush. So it's important that here I'm sampling and I control what I'm going to use for the replacements. After this, it's just really continuing the same technique, going over these details. And once again, removing all of these scratches. We can also go over the hair and remove these lines from there as well. There's a bit more here, also on the eyebrows. Now, if I zoom out, you can see it already looks much better. That was before. This is after. I'm not 100% happy with the hair, but at this stage, I'm mainly concerned about these two really distracting lines here. So I'm just going to keep painting over these details and trying to align also on the edge like that. Then also around the lips, I want to make sure we are not removing the lips, of course. Then go over these details here. And you see alt clicking all the time, sampling and aligning, doing the same thing here to create or recreate these details. We can do the same over the hair, just sampling from around it. And it's good to know that we have an option called diffusion. This is also only available in CC, which you can change around. Let me show you what happens if we reduce it down to 1. So if I now sample from, let's say, here and paint over these details, diffusion will make sure that the new detail won't blend too much. So it's not going to blend. It's almost like using the clone stamp tool. It still blends around the edges, but inside the brush, it's going to work more like the clone stamp tool. So that's in a nutshell. If you reduce the diffusion, you get closer to the clone stamp. The higher this value is, the more blended result you will get. I prefer to keep this around 3, so it's not blending too much. It's more like copying, but then at the same time, it's also creating a little bit new details by blending things together. So I'm just going to do the same thing here as well. Let's just go over these little details that we have to also refine. Of course, I'm leaving the most complex one to last, the eye, because that's the trickiest bit. But it all depends on the selection or the sampling point that you choose. I'm just going to go over first above the eye. Then the eyebrow should be sampled from somewhere around there. So it maintains the eyebrow and won't leave a gap there. That looks quite good. Now for the eye, we can again sample from here maybe. But instead of sampling, we can also use the clone stamp tool. So let's just pick the clone stamp tool. I'm going to reduce the size. I'm going to sample from around there. And then I align and click and click. So you see, if you sample from the right detail, it's actually quite fast and easy to do even complicated details like that. Now, the only detail I would like to improve is somewhere around this part here. So I just go over that. And then we can also maybe go over this part here. And then just a little bit on the dress, we should also remove the scratches from here and from there. So now if we zoom out, we did quite a good job. So that was before, this is after, removing the scratches. But now let's have a look at what else we can do to improve the image. So first of all, of course, I would go through the background and remove all those little details. But as an overall effect, we could increase the contrast in this image and the sharpness of it as well. And to do that, I'm going to actually use the camera raw filter. So I'm going to select both layers and choose filter, convert for smart filters, and then apply the camera raw filter on top of that. Here, I'm going to increase the clarity, which will give me quite a good contrast on the image. So let's see, that was before and after. So we increase the contrast. We can also play around with these values here. So we can increase shadows, decrease highlights a bit. So just we can see a little bit more, once again, before and after. And then if we want to increase sharpness, we can go there and we can just increase the amount of sharpness, but at the same time I would also increase the noise reduction, and that actually not just reduces the noise but also removes some of the scratches from the background. So this was before, this is after. So at the same time we increased contrast and also reduce some of the noise and scratches from the image, which is quite a good result. Now, I can still add a bit more sharpening if I want, but I think that works quite well. So I'm going to click OK. And once again, we can see before and after. We could go into the Smart Object and make some more changes on the retouch layer, or we can just go straight into coloring now. For coloring, most of the times what I do is to use either adjustment layers or just even simply a layer set to color blend mode. Let me show you both techniques. So if I create a new layer and just set it straight away to color blend mode, I can start using my brush, and remember the shortcut for the hot color picker. Select the color you think is necessary. In this case, I'm looking for something for the skin tones. So I'm just going to pick something, a subtle color like this here. And then if I start painting with this, I can even set my opacity down to, let's say, 40%. Start painting slowly over these details. I can already start to introduce the skin tones. And then the more I paint over, the more is going to add that color. Of course, you shouldn't just use one color because skin tones varies. Like we can quickly change this color more towards the blush area, and then we can add a bit of blush. That's probably too much. So let me reduce the opacity down to 10% by pressing 10 on the keyboard. We can add a bit of blush also around there, and we can use the same color to paint over the lips, just to introduce a bit of red there. Let's say we want to make her blonde, so I'm just going to pick a brighter color like this and then start introducing that color on the hair. So as you can see, all these colors I added on one layer, which is set to color blend mode, but then you can always use multiple layers with different blend modes as well. The advantage of using separate layers with different blend modes is that the color will change slightly. Even if you use the same color, you can see, for example, with an additional overlay blend mode, we can use the same color, but it will be adding slightly different tones to the face. So I'm going to paint over these details, and let's see before and after. So this was without the overlay, and this is together with it. So the combination of an overlay, color, and maybe even multiply and screen blending layers will give you a very natural look on both skin tones, background, clothes, and so on and so forth. Although you can get a quick result with this technique, it's still not easy to master coloring black and white photos. It takes quite a lot of practice, and especially you have to be very good at color theory. You have to find a lot of reference photos, and you have to be very patient. It is an art form, almost like illustration, but once you give these tools a try, you will see how much fun it is, and it's really something worth practicing. Before I finish, let me show you one other way of adding colors. That's by using adjustment layers. And I mainly use the hue saturation adjustment layer because that has that brilliant feature called colorize. So if I turn that on, you'll see it will apply everywhere. So I first try to get a good skin tone. Looking at the other girl's face, I'm just going to probably increase the lightness or reduce it, something like that. And also, while having colorize here, we can also change the blend mode of this adjustment layer to color. That way, when we are changing this value, it won't really affect the brightness of the details. It will just affect the way this adjustment is added. So now I can pick the color that I think suits this the best. We can reduce the saturation. Let's just say something like this as the skin tone. Now, I can press Command or Control I to invert the whole adjustment, and then just using the brush tool with a white soft edge brush. It can be set to lower opacity or higher opacity, but then once you start painting over details, you see we can introduce the skin tones or the colors on this girl on the right. The good thing about using the hue saturation adjustment layer is that you can always adjust the hue later on and the saturation as well. So you have free control over this even after you applied it. The only disadvantage is that you need to have separate adjustment layers for each color. So if I want to have blonde hair on this girl here on the right, I would have to create another adjustment layer for that. And it's good to name your layers. So I'm going to call this skin tones. And then I'm going to call the new one hair. And I already set this up as colorize, and I'm going to also set up the blend mode to color. And then I'm going to look for a color that I can use for the blonde hair. Something like that. We can also maybe make it brighter or maybe darker in this case, something like that. So now I can invert it and then use the brush tool to paint over the details where I want this to come out. And you can of course use 100% of full opacity. Because it's a separate layer, it's very easy to make adjustments and reduce the effect if we want to. But you see, that's already another technique. So I already showed you two different ways of doing the same colorization effect. So that was adjustment layers, and this on the left side is just simply using layers set to color blend mode and using the brush to paint over the details. And that's all I wanted to show you in this video, and also that's all I wanted to show you about retouching. So now we finished another big topic. In the next video, I will show you a very useful tool which ships together with Photoshop. It's called Adobe Bridge, and this is the application we use for managing files and organize our images that we use for Photoshop or other Adobe applications.